Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this lovely spring day. I'm Michael Green, Senior Vice President for Asia here at CSIS, and it is my great delight to welcome Gideon Rachman today to talk about his new book, Easternization, Asia's Rise and America's Decline from Obama to Trump and Beyond. We are here to talk about the book, to talk about Asia, to talk about the future, and first briefly to talk about security, which we always do. The exits that way, and our rallying point, unless you decide to just go have a beer, is at National Geographic around the corner. It's the era we live in. So Gideon Rachman, I think all of you have read and know his work, know his arguments. He's the Chief Foreign Affairs commentator for the Financial Times. He joined the FT in 2006. After 15 years at The Economist. I've been following him the entire time, and then from The Economist to the FT. He served as correspondent for The Economist in DC, and Brussels, and Bangkok. He's won a number of prizes, including the Orwell Prize, which is sort of Britain's version of the Pulitzer Prize, for a book he wrote in 2016. He's edited The Economist Business and Asia sections. He has an interest in American foreign policy, the European Union, globalization, and of course Asia. I'll invite Gideon now to give us a quick overview of the book, and then I'll ask a couple of questions I've been dying to ask, having read it, and we'll open it up to your questions after that. So Gideon, thanks for joining us. Looking forward to it.
Well, thank you very much, Mike, and thanks for inviting me here. I must say, it's both a kind of honor and slightly inhibiting to be talking about the US-China relationship here at CSIS, because so much of the best work on this subject comes out here. And I must say, when I sat down to write a book, and the US-China relationship is sort of at the center of the book, I had to ask myself, what can I, as a Brit living in London, add to all the stuff that's being produced in Washington, Beijing, and so on? So what I did, or tried to do in the book, is to sort of broaden out the perspective in a couple of ways. The first is historically, to try to place the geopolitical situation that we find ourselves in a much broader historical frame, a really kind of 500-year frame, and to see it as part of a story of first the emergence of Western dominance of the world, and then an argument that we may be coming to the end of that period, hence Easternization. And the second thing is to look at the US-China relationship and at geopolitics in Asia, but then to place it in a wider global context. Because if I'm right that the economic dynamism of Asia has now got to the stage where it's changing the whole world order, then it's worth looking at how different parts of the world are reacting to that. So the second bit of the book, the first bit's about Asia, and the second bit is about Europe, about the Middle East, about Russia, Africa, and so on, and how the world order is changing in response to the rise of Asia. So to backtrack a bit, why do I think that you can make this argument that we're at a sort of historic tipping point, to use the cliche? Well, if you go back to the beginning of the European imperial age, it's probably it's the late 1400s. You have the great voyages of exploration, Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and that begins the period of European colonial domination of the world. And so by the early 20th century, European countries that are either European colonies or offshoot cultures of Europe, such as the United States, Australia, are about 80% of the world's landmass, and they dominate the world's sea routes. Even when the European empires end, largely after the Second World War, you have the US then becoming the dominant global power, and the continuation of the West, and even Russia is actually a European nation. So the Euro-Atlantic area continues to be the center of global politics. And you continue to have this period where the rest of the world finds its politics, its global conditions shaped by what's happening in the West. And I think that that's now, we're just beginning to see that change. In '89, of course, the Berlin Wall falls, and it seems like the ultimate moment of triumph for the West. But it's also a period when actually sort of behind the scenes, at least in political terms, there's this incredible economic boom going on in Asia. It starts in Japan in the 60s, moves on to South Korea and Southeast Asia in the 70s. 78, crucially, Deng Xiaoping comes to power at the end of that year in China, and you get the Chinese takeoff. And then in 1991, India sort of embraces economic reform as well. And the addition of India, the fact that India and China then begin to follow the pattern that had been first developed in Southeast Asia is of enormous significance simply because of the size of these countries. So the development of South Korea is remarkable, but ultimately it's not that many people. But if you have two countries of 1 billion people developing, growing at rates of 7, 8, 9%, that is a world-changing event. And for me, just to bring myself into the story, I was a correspondent in Southeast Asia in 92 to 95 and then edited the Asia Pages. And it always seemed to me that although The Economist at the time was treating it primarily as an economic story, we would reach a point where this was going to change international politics. And I think that at that point, it becomes very evident really in the Obama years in a number of ways. I don't want to go on and on, but obviously, I think as you point out in your book, Obama is the first US president to say, actually, Asia is the central focus of my foreign policy vision for the world. And that is, even if there's plenty to critique about, is there really any there in the pivot? Was it done well? Those are all legitimate questions. But it's a moment when the US does that. Equally, though, I think there's a sense both behind the scenes in Washington and around the world that it's also a period when the constraints on American power become much more evident. Now, Obama rhetorically, outwardly, can't really say that, and he says, I think, there's no other power that's even close to us. But if you look behind the scenes, I actually have a little quote. The Nick report in 2012, they wrote, Pax Americana, the era of American ascendancy in international politics that began in 1945 is fast winding down. That's the National Intelligence Council. And actually, rather prescient words, because in 2012, Xi Jinping comes to power and you get a more assertive China, but also it's just before the debacle of Syria really begins to unfold and it becomes clear that the US is losing its grip in the Middle East, and it's 2 years before Russia annexes Crimea, and a sense there that again, the West generally is unable to mount a coherent response. And I think it's important to think of this in terms of the West, because although there was a lot of critiques of Obama for being, inverted commas, weak, for not doing enough, actually the weakest part of the Western alliance is the European Union, which is wrapped up in the Euro crisis, now has Britain leaving. And I think that is a problem for the US, because the West has two wings, and if the EU is in big trouble, who does America partner with? So just a couple more qualifications before we then go to the thing. I think one important qualification to the whole idea of Easternization is, though there's all sorts of important economic stats that I can come up with. In 2014, the IMF says that China is now the world's largest economy, at least ranked by purchasing power, and that 3 of the 4 largest economies in the world are now in Asia: China, Japan, and India. That China, we can see, is now the world's largest manufacturer, the world's largest exporter. What is the case is that there is no East to offset against the West. So you can talk about a Western alliance, NATO, you can talk about a Western idea. Asia, as you well know, is deeply divided. So there is no kind of Eastern bloc. And that indeed gives America its opening to maintain its position in Asia and the Pacific by partnering with allies, with Japan and others. But I don't think it negates the idea of Easternization even in Asia for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think that China is attempting to resume its traditional historical role as the dominant power in Asia. And I think it's got a shot at that. And you can see that playing out in the minds of America's allies, who in security terms are very concerned by the rise of China. And that makes them want to partner more with America, but equally have this nagging sense that maybe inevitably this is just the way it's going to go. All of them now, their major market is China. The question marks about, under Obama, about, well, how serious is America? How far will it go? And now under Trump, about what really is the new president's priorities? Are they trade? Has he got every Asian country with a surplus in his kind of crosshairs? Or is he going to pivot on security issues? He goes backwards and forwards on Taiwan, on the South China Sea. And just that very uncertainty, I think, is damaging to America. Now, of course, Trump may sort it out, and he may sort it out this week. We'll get a very clear, well, probably won't get a clear sense, but we may get a clearer sense of what his priorities are as he, does he make North Korea the focus? Does he make trade the focus? And then just to finish on the last thought of how this is affecting the rest of the world. I think it was very interesting for me because I do have to sort of dot in and out of lots of situations around the world. You know, for a while I was writing a lot about Ukraine during the Arab Spring, about that. The extent to which the sense that America's untrammeled sort of dominance of the world system, which I think was at its peak in the 90s after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that is eroding, is then changing the way countries see themselves, their choices. Just to give you a couple of examples, Turkey's a really interesting example, which a country which really since Ataturk, since the 1920s, has just always wanted to go one way, towards the West, towards Europe. Now, Erdogan's changed that, is a much more Islamist approach to the world, more interested in the Ottoman heritage of Turkey, and partly that's all internal to Turkey, but I think it's also to do with the sense that actually the West no longer has all the answers and all the power, and there are other places that we can look at. Russia, when it's really on its uppers, after what happens in the 90s and then the confrontation with the West, as they become more anti-Western post-Crimea, have become more focused on the Asian part of their heritage. It's quite interesting. You talk to Russian intellectuals, they will say, or some of them will say, look, it was always a mistake to think that we were a European power. We've always had our own history. You know, so much of our country's actually in Asia, the Mongol heritage, et cetera, et cetera. They're beginning to reimagine themselves as an Eastern power as much as a Western power. And then in Africa, where China's really, it's the first place outside Asia where China's now become a major presence. And I think there was a symbolic moment when Obama goes to speak to the Organization of African Unity in Addis, and quite an effective speech where he says, you know, I'm an American, but I'm also a son of Africa, a standing ovation. But the building he's speaking in, the OAU building, has been built and financed by the Chinese. When he drives to the building, there's a huge industrial estate full of Chinese companies. Even in the Americas, you know, America's backyard, you see evidence of big Chinese investments in the Bahamas, in Mexico, and so on. So there's a competition going on, and that's given lots of countries different options and different ways of thinking about, well, do we want to continue to put all our eggs into the Western basket, or actually is the future going to be increasingly to do with the rise of China, and then in a few years' time the rise of India and so on? So that's I think the moment we're in.
Excellent. Let me start by saying some of the things I enjoyed about the book that I think people will really enjoy if they haven't read it, and probably enjoyed if they did. I like it that this book is not just about China, and it's not just about Asia, and that it really is touring around the world and asking about the West. And it raises questions. Can the West include countries like Indonesia and Japan and India, for example? But it's not just a sort of classic rise of China story. And I think that's compelling. I like it that the reader gets to be a fly on the wall for Gideon Rachman's travels and meetings with intellectual elites in 5 different continents. In the book, you apologize a little bit. You're very modest and say your bias is towards elites because that's who you talk to as a journalist. But it's actually great fun. Well, first of all, it must be great fun to be Gideon Rachman when you read the book, because to take these debates from Istanbul to Tokyo to Delhi and meet not with 1 or 2 intellectuals, but sort of bounce the ideas off of the debates that are happening in those countries it makes it a very enjoyable read, but it's a big plus. You shouldn't have been so modest about it. It makes it really interesting. And that you engage the reader in a debate with so many different points of view. This is not a linear argument. You raise, I'd say, more questions than you answer. Sure. And I'm going to ask you about some of those. And I like the conclusion. This when I was reading this, it reminded me of when I was in the NSC, landing in Shannon Airport in Ireland with Condoleezza Rice, and we had wind shear. So we were going this way and going that way, and all the Secret Service guys were swearing off drink. And then all of a sudden, we just had this beautiful, smooth landing, and the sun came out. And that's what this book was like for me. Because you go to my friend Hugh White, China Choice, big, bad decisions, tough decisions, China's influence. But where you come out on Asia is at the very end, when you say, in the end, however, I'm not convinced by the argument that China will dominate Asia. If the United States were motivated simply by a desire to maintain global dominance for its own sake, then it would be foolhardy to risk a war with China to sustain US power. However, it is clear that the majority of China's neighbors, including India, Japan, South Korea, most of the nations of Southeast Asia, and Australia, are very uncomfortable with the idea of living in a China-dominated region. So you come out, you pull up just at the last minute, but the turbulence stays in our head. And I didn't swear off drinking, but it definitely challenges people to think about what we do in the complex world you describe. First, I want to ask you about the title. Not Easternization, I like that. It reminds me, as I was saying earlier, the great American strategist Alfred Thayer Mahan wrote a book 120 years ago called The Problem of Asia, which argued for the first time that dynamics within East Asia were going to shape the whole global order. He was a little early, and that's, I think Easternization kind of captures that. But the subtitle struck me, Asia's Rise and Americans' Decline. But then you say from Obama to Trump and beyond. So my first thought was, as the senior director for Asia in the Bush administration, you clearly think that decline began after I left in the White House. So I wanted to establish that for the record. So it's on you, you Obama guys. But I wanted to get you to say more about this. Obama to Trump is a particular period in history. It's after the global financial crisis, which may or may not have been the beginning of a new trajectory in global power. The Chinese thought it was, but maybe it's not. It captures an era when the Obama administration, or many in the administration, thought cooperation on global issues like climate change with China will sort of put great power rivalry in politics behind us, and it didn't, and we now know that. And then even Donald Trump in the first few months, we'll find out more tomorrow, but seems to be changing with respect to China policy, Japan policy, not trade policy yet, but in some ways back to the norm. So the first question is this a story about the Obama and early Trump period that is forecasting our future, or are there things about this period you're writing in that are perhaps footnotes in history?
That's a really big question. Firstly, I mean, I did hesitate before using the word decline because it's a sort of distracting word. Once you use it, you either get people's backs up or they love it, but they kind of focus on that word. And then putting the word relative into a cover, you're not going to do that. So, but I mean, I mean, without being too facetious, oddly enough, the book's come out at a period when both sides of the American political spectrum, in a weird way, have embraced a form of declinism. Trump, after all, says there's carnage out there, this is our last chance, the country's on the slide. That's the whole idea. And his opponents agree that America's in terrible decline because he's president. In a weird way, it's a less controversial word to use now than it might have been 5 years ago. But to the substance of your question, I think that is the big question. Are we simply living through a period a bit like the sort of 70s, when the West was very down on itself, the Jimmy Carter malaise speech, and then actually we were over-focused on our own weaknesses and under-focused on the weaknesses of the other places, and hey presto, 10 years later, it's actually Western triumph rather than Western decline. That's, if you're intellectually honest, you've got to say nobody can be sure about these things. In fact, the big events of my life as a journalist were largely unanticipated. Who was really talking about the fall of the Berlin Wall in '87? I know Reagan made a speech, but nobody thought it was actually going to happen. And then 9/11 changes the world again. The global financial crisis, similarly. There are these big exogenous shocks, and nobody really can anticipate them. But I think that my bet is on this not being just a cyclical change, because I think that the shift in economic power to Asia generally, of which China is now at the moment the most important part, has actually been going on for sort of 50, 60 years now. And it's also the case that people are certainly right to point to the instability in China and to point to the idea there could be an economic crash, there could be political turmoil, there probably will be both at some point. And I think when that happens, a lot of people will say, told you so, it was all a mirage, etc. But I think they'll be wrong, because actually if you look at the rise of the United States, it was punctuated by immense instability, a civil war indeed in the mid-19th century. But once a large country gets rolling on this rapid economic development. It actually takes a lot to derail that. I mean, Germany is defeated in 2 world wars, and by the 1950s is once again a major industrial power. So I find it hard to see us blinking and saying, oh, China, we imagined that. That's not going to happen, I think. And within that, similarly, India is, it's now growing at 7 to 8%. It's much poorer than China, but I think you sense a confidence in India now that they're on the move, and I think they're probably right.
You don't make predictions, for people who haven't read the book. You sort of weigh the averages and the odds and the historical patterns, to be fair. You do make one prediction, or seem to, when you describe Bob Zoellick as the last internationalist Republican.
Did I? God, I've forgotten that. Sorry about that.
So hopefully you're wrong on that one, but we'll see. Let me ask you a little bit more about the trajectory and challenge you a bit more on the argument you just laid out. I was originally a Japan guy in this business. I did my graduate work in the late 80s and early 90s when Goldman Sachs predicted Japan would surpass US GDP by 2005, when most of the academics, particularly in political science, were arguing that Japan had created a new form of national security based on techno-nationalism, and we were basically toast.
Yep.
And then the Japanese bubble collapsed.
Japan is number one, all of that.
All of it. So I mean, I fell for all of it. May have studied the wrong language, we'll see. Even, the America Firsters, straying a bit far afield, but, Lindbergh and the America Firsters, part of their resistance to intervening in Europe was tinged with anti-Semitism, with Irish and German anti-Anglo sentiments, but a lot of it was they thought Hitler would win. There were a lot of people who were projecting that we shouldn't get involved because...
Sure, and in the early 60s, there are people who think the Soviet Union.
Right. So with all that as background, you describe the arguments that the Chinese economy will collapse, and then I think dismiss them pretty effectively. But collapse isn't the only scenario. The question is, can China get out of what the World Bank called the middle income trap? And can it do that without having a more open and information-based society? Can it become an information-based technological giant? I mean, it's not just the collapse scenario or the coming bubble for China, but can they emerge out of this enormous trench they're in terms of manufacturing and assembly and move up the value chain in ways that really only Equatorial Guinea has in recent history?
Yeah. Well, there are a couple of, it's a big question with so many different angles of attack on it. I mean, I think, firstly, some of the parallels with Japan work. I mean, the demographic argument. In fact, the one big question mark about China's future that I don't think I've got a pat response to is the aging thing. I mean, I think it is somebody or other wrote, if you study Japan, you have a pretty advanced respect for demographics, that it does matter. That said, I think that the China is the new Japan argument, and we're just making the same old mistake, for me doesn't work, simply because the idea in retrospect of Japan as number one was slightly absurd because there just weren't enough Japanese. I mean, for Japan to have been the largest economy in the world, they would have had to have a GDP per capita double America's. That wasn't going to happen. I think that we are, however, entering an odd period, or a new kind of period where we have to reimagine what it is to be a wealthy country, because in the period of American dominance, the richest people in the world lived in the biggest economy in the world, and the two seemed to go together. America had the highest standard of living, and also was the biggest economy. Simply because the scale of China, they only have to get to sort of 20% of American living standards, and in real exchange rates, they're sort of up there. So we're going to have to get used to an idea in which countries can be the largest economy in the world, but actually have relatively poor living standards, and that's, I think, going to have all sorts of interesting psychological, geopolitical effects. But what I would say finally to the idea, can they get out of the middle income trap? Maybe not, but in terms of just having the raw economic resources to project power, they're sort of already there. They're a huge economy. They will grow, I think, for a while yet. You know the stats better than I do on the military spending. You can see the size of the Chinese market and what that does to the clout it gives them, so that all of America's major security allies in Asia now, their largest market is China, Japan, Australia, South Korea, and that it's very interesting to see, even over the past year, the way that China is using that leverage now, that economic leverage. We'll see how effective it is, but it's a weapon they're using against South Korea now over THAAD. They're leaning on the Australians. Incredible statement by Li Keqiang. He was there saying, "We want you guys to stay neutral when when there's a clash with America. Stay on the sidelines." But they feel they can say that because they know that the Australian mines are producing essentially for China.
So the Chinese criticism of THAAD, the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Missile System, the U.S. missile defense system the U.S. is deploying in Korea, has actually increased support for THAAD within the South Korean public. The Chinese use of mercantile tools to punish Japan in 2012 over the Senkaku Jiayu led to a rapid diversion of Japan's portfolio away from rare earth metals in China. Went from 90-some% to about 60%. Is it possible, do you think, this is how China sustained its hegemony a millennia ago, but is it possible in today's world for China to sustain its hegemony with sticks? And are the carrots sufficient? I mean, if you think about the Anglo-American model, essentially an open trading order, and especially for the US in the 20th century, an open economy, rules that allowed smaller states to kick us around a bit in the WTO, in the GATT before that, in the Uruguay round, in the UN. This is John Eichenberg's argument.
Yeah.
Sort of the liberal Leviathan. The China we're seeing today is not going to be a liberal Leviathan. So is that kind of growing hegemony possible? Will it backfire? Or can China, I personally don't see a Beijing consensus even in Beijing. So is it attraction? Is it compellence? What does it have to be different to head down the route where it's the dominant power that it could be?
Well, I think that they're only just emerging on the world stage, so there's an element of trial and error. And it's interesting what you say about the extent to which actually using these sticks too crudely can backfire. But I guess they're at the point where they're trying to get people used to the idea. I think the thing about a stick is that you shouldn't have to brandish it. People should sort of know it's there. And it's interesting that another country that's under pressure, it's just not had till recently, is Singapore, which is one of probably the only country I can think of in the world which genuinely has a special relationship with both the US and China, and which now is suddenly feeling the heat of Chinese disapproval. But it's certainly possible that they can overplay their hand. It's also actually writing this book it was a reminder to me that you can overinterpret this year's news. So if the stuff I was writing about South Korea 2 or 3 years ago, it looked like they were tilting towards China. There was a definite warming, and I think the Americans were quite worried about it, and then geopolitics changes for a while. So you have to try and identify the trend. And it seems to me that in Southeast Asia, at least at the moment, you can see more countries that are tilting towards China than away, and some of them quite close allies in the past of America, Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines. And if I look at my own country, actually the Chinese are capable of quite crude threats. I mean, even at the FT, we printed an ad from the Taiwanese, and a guy from the embassy showed up and said, you really shouldn't have done that. We'd like you to pulp the entire paper and reproduce it without that ad. And we said, no, we're not going to do that, actually. But the fact that he felt able to say it was pretty remarkable. But more generally, I mean, the British, particularly post-Brexit, are going to definitely temper their criticism of China. It's not a very dignified spectacle, but you can see it happening already.
I thought, I'm an Anglophile, but I'm not a Britain expert. I thought May was on nuclear power and some other issues.
She hesitated.
A little bit tougher than Cameron had been.
It was a moment. She sounded like she was going to pull out of that nuclear deal, but then I think they thought about it and they thought, this will so piss off the Chinese that we can't do it, particularly post-Brexit, because the whole idea, it may be an illusion, but is that there's this sort of big, in a way, Brexit is an example of the Easternization, because insofar as there's a coherent idea behind it, is that Europe is no longer the future is Asia, we've tied ourselves to the sort of shrinking bit of the global economy. But if you're going to try to make that a reality, you can't then, they think, start doing things like having the Dalai Lama around the team.
Singapore is playing a good game. You cite Professor Wang Jishu of Beida, of Beijing University, and I was in a meeting with him recently where he was telling us that the Singaporeans were telling him we want more of China in Southeast Asia, and all the Americans are saying, well, the Singaporeans are telling us China's stealing the march on you. We want more of America in Southeast Asia. So we agreed on the spot we needed to have a U.S.-China strategic dialogue about Singapore because they're playing us both. Historically, rising powers, we did this. Germany did this under Bismarck. Japan did it. Historically, rising powers in the last 200 years have exhibited revisionist behavior in their neighborhoods. We did it to all our neighbors except Canada. We lost to them 3 times. Bismarck did it. Japan did it. But for most of that period, these regional hegemons or rising powers free ride on the global power. And China is now largely free riding on the US. And the major problems we have are, in security terms, largely about East Asia, about China's own neighborhood. So you cite John Eichenberg in the book where he says, look, on global issues, the US and China may both be status quo powers. And President Obama, at least initially, seemed to think working on climate change would kind of solidify the relationship, marginalize or downplay the regional tensions. It didn't. And then you raise institutions and you say we have the institutional edge in the West because we designed all of these institutions in the Bretton Woods system and so forth. And then you rightly criticize the US for essentially opposing the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIB. What do you think about that? Are the global challenges and our institutions, global institutions, going to be an arena for intense confrontation, or potentially maybe that's where we start to find common ground? And just finally, I'd mentioned, for example, the AIIB. It's interesting that, as I understand it, they've only done 2 loans, and they were both with the World Bank.
Yeah. No, I think
so.
In retrospect, maybe the American reaction to the AIIB was not only a mistake, but also a bit hysterical, because when it happened, Larry Summers wrote a piece for us, actually, saying, this is the biggest setback for American economic diplomacy since Bretton Woods. It was a really remarkably gloomy piece, and actually maybe it wasn't such a big deal. We'll probably have a better sense in 10 years' time. But the institutional thing, the chapter is probably the sort of driest chapter in the book, so you may want to skip it. But I felt, as you set out a thesis, you also have to try to be sort of intellectually honest and think, well, what are the weaknesses in it? And that it is obviously too crude to see power purely in terms of economics or even military stuff. And that it occurred to me that one of the enduring strengths of the West is that people trust our institutions relatively than the Chinese. It's the old thing, would you put all your money in a Chinese bank? Or if you're Chinese, particularly if you're Chinese, might you try and get quite a lot of it out and put it into a flat in London and an account in Switzerland and all of that? And that's because you kind of trust the rule of law. You think it's not going to be possible for there to be a change of government and somebody just come and grab it. And that is a big edge for the West. And you can see it translating into power. I mean, actually, oddly, the thing that made me think about it was when all the football executives from FIFA were arrested in Switzerland. And these were Latin Americans and Africans, and they were arrested in Switzerland because of an FBI probe. Well, why? How could that happen? It was a real interesting demonstration of American power, and it was partly because they were using American banks, and that made them subject to American legal reach. So that kind of thing. Similarly, one of the, a lot of people in Britain are focused at the moment on the city, will it go post-Brexit? But another big thing that happens is the number of companies and contracts, even Asians, who write that their contract, if there's a dispute, will be arbitrated in London. And that's, again, it's a sort of form of soft power, which is real power, that if people want to use your legal system because they trust it. But I don't think we can take it for granted anymore. I mean, I think that there's an argument that in Britain, actually, our system has been corrupted by the flows of Russian money, the numbers of kind of slightly dubious people who are able to employ the best law firms, the best PR firms, etc. Is there an erosion of standards there? And obviously, Trump has raised big questions about the robustness of American institutions, which will play out over time. And to the extent that, I slightly worry that the Russians and the Chinese may recognize something in Trump and say, oh yeah, we know this way of doing business. You give a contract to the family, you do this, et cetera, et cetera. And so we can't, I think, take for granted that institutional edge will, unless we really guard it and are aware of it, and understand that it's a long game and that it may be awkward sometimes to maintain these things, but they're crucial not just to our sense of integrity in ourselves, but also to Western power.
The head of the AIIB wanted to do these loans with the World Bank in large part because it would give legitimacy and prestige. I think also because he wanted protection against corrupt state-owned enterprises, Politburo members in China who wanted to use the AIIB as a cash cow.
Sure.
But your point about these institutions being penetrable with corruption and our own sort of standing in the world is really, really critical. Why don't I open it up? I may ask you another question to follow up, but let's open it up to the audience. If you could raise your hand, and I'll call on you, have mics, and if you could briefly identify yourself. Up front here, if you could wait for the mic, we'd appreciate it.
Yeah. Charles Duran at Johns Hopkins SAIS. I appreciate very much the long view that you bring to this, and also the fact that you are talking to lots of people and telling us what they said about us. That's very helpful. But there's for me, a kind of a ghost of Brexit in the background of your mind. And I would say more than Brexit, I would say the ghost of Scotland, which is, in a sense, something we would never have anticipated 30 years ago. And you mentioned that Obama's visit or orientation with regard to the pivot is a kind of maybe a sign of weakness, or you implied this. Isn't it better, wouldn't it be more prudent, instead of talking about decline and rise and so on, to talk about a changing balance of power? And if I were in China, I think that's the way I would look at this relationship. A new balance of power, especially given, as you said, the division that exists in Asia itself.
True.
That's very susceptible to undue balance of power.
Yeah. Well, I think the point you make about the way the British think about this is a very valid one. It's the one that's occurred to me. I mean, I think the British are potentially over gloomy about America because we project our own history onto America. And I remember seeing a pretty senior British kind of security foreign policy type giving a speech at it's almost a retirement speech, and saying, the big story of my life has basically been the decline of British power. And when I started, we could really make things happen all over the world, and that's really no longer the case. And he said, and the big story for the next generation is going to be the decline of American power and the emergence of China as the dominant power in the system. Oh, wow. And I did think, you may be over projecting. There are echoes of it, but obviously America is not in the situation of Britain even in 1918, let alone 1945. That said, I think that you can, this is back to the question we were talking about earlier. Of course, we're slightly guessing, but I think that certainly in the minds of the Chinese, there is a sense that their time is returning, and it's hard to dispute that they've got a pretty good case to make. They see themselves as having had two bad centuries, and it's a very interesting actually comparing the way that the Chinese and the Americans think about history, because America is such a young country, and it's really only been, accumulated power. It's only been one way. So the idea that that could come to an end, or that you might have a downswing, seems profoundly kind of wrong and unnatural, and it's not the way it would be. Whereas because the Chinese have this sort of cyclical, you literally can have 200 bad years and then a better dynasty comes along. But I do think that, certainly, the book starts with this meeting I attended with Xi Jinping in Beijing, where he said to a bunch of Western visitors, the project is the great rejuvenation of the Chinese people, and that's what we're about. And although it was put in rather deliberately reassuring language, if you go to the museums of the Chinese history, the whole narrative is that we've had a century of humiliation, and now then they won't quite say it, but obviously they took a wrong economic path under Mao, but now things are on the move. And I like all nationalist narratives, you can puncture holes in it, but I think it's pretty convincing. And actually not just in China. you have a sense in Asia generally that it's harder to, you don't see so much in the West of that the future's going to be better, that things are on the move, dynamism. It's not just in Chinese cities, you feel it to some extent in India, in Southeast Asia. And the sort of sense of despondency that's been in Europe, quote Carlo de Benedetti in the book, who said, there's the Italian industrialist, who said to me, when I go to China now, it feels like Italy used to feel in the 50s, where, you know, everybody was on the up, they were getting their first television, washing machine, car. People felt a sense that definitely their kids would be better off than them. They could see it. But that sense that actually our time is past, which was really just in Europe, I thought was very much a theme of this last presidential election. What was Trump talking about other than saying, you know, what's gone wrong? Something's gone badly wrong. And I thought Bannon, who I gather has lost his job or part of his job today, but he gave a quite interesting interview shortly after the election where he said, globalism was a huge mistake, and we've created a middle class in Asia and destroyed the middle class in America. Now, that's you know, I'm not endorsing that viewpoint, but clearly enough people in America sort of felt that way to have elected Trump.
Yes. Up front here on your left.
Hi, I'm Jake Breach from the Defense Intelligence Agency. A couple years ago, in 2013 and 14, you wrote about the echoes of World War I in terms of the U.S.-China relationship. And I just want to ask, in light of this book and things that happened in the last 3 or 4 years, how do you feel about that now, and where do you think the relationship is going?
Well, it's funny. I mean, it wasn't just me, actually. I sort of inadvertently caused a minor international incident by asking Shinzo Abe about it. I was told, actually, I could only ask one question because there were so many other people in the audience. I was starting the discussion off, so I thought I might as well sort of go for the jugular and said, is it possible you could go to war with China? And rather than doing the obvious thing and saying, oh, no, that's totally inconceivable, he said, well, you meant... and he brought up the First World War parallel, and Kissinger writes a lot about it, and others. You know, it is intriguing. It was, however, pre-nuclear age, and I think that is the big distinction, and Graham Allison's book on Thucydides' Trap is going to come out again, and it's striking that all his examples of, oh my God, this leads to war, are all pre the nuclear age. So we just don't know whether the possession of nuclear weapons has actually ended that idea that the great power is going to clash with the rising power. I mean, I think it is the case that if you look back at the mood in Europe in 1914, the famously British thought initially the war would all be over by Christmas. They didn't think that this was going to be as destructive and as appalling as it turned out to be. I think that it would be hard to imagine that anyone in Beijing or Washington could lightly assume, well, we'll have a war with the other great power and that'll be fine, you know. But I think the danger is that maybe that you could have a minor clash that would escalate, a sort of Archduke Franz Ferdinand incident, which gets out of hand. And there's somebody quoted in the book who's a fairly senior US official who startled me by saying, oh, there'll definitely be a clash, you know, that'll be out in the South China Sea. And I sort of looked a bit startled. He said, oh, but don't worry, you know, everyone will get on the phone and it'll all calm down in a couple of days. And the risk is that that's wrong.
Yeah. Well, in Graham Allison, I've read, he sent me a proof, but in Graham Allison's book on the Thucydides Trap, he has, I think, 15 cases. And the only one that didn't end in a war in the last 300 years was Britain and the US in the early 20th century when, during the Second World War, Harold Macmillan said, Eisenhower, we'll be the Greeks, you can be the Romans. What do we say to the Chinese? We'll be the Romans, you can be the...
Yeah. Well,
I mean, do you see that as an option or scenario to sort of hand the mantle of leadership or share it the way Britain did with the U.S.?
No, because the transition of power from Britain to the U.S. is so much easier because they're such similar cultures and have the same language. They just finished a war where they'd fought on the same side. So the British sort of felt they were handing over to a relative.
Yeah.
I don't think that the Americans and the Chinese could have that kind of sense. Nor do I think, frankly, that America's in that position yet. But there is a challenge to American hegemony in Asia. And that really matters because Asia is now the core of the global economy. So you can't just say, oh, well, it's kind of one region in the world. If you lose that, it's big stuff.
Yeah, in the back.
Thank you. Danielle Capalbo, I traveled all the way from Boston to attend your talk today.
Thank you.
My question is perfectly understandable for China to want to rise again and reclaim its lost past glory. What I found a little unsettling is that in the journey of doing so, I see all around me strategic U.S. companies being bought up. I'll give you a very good example.
Can you keep it brief so we can get some more?
So I don't need to go into details. I think that's well understood.
Yeah.
I see the same thing with Chinese investment going into established private schools and well-regarded public schools. So I would like to hear what your thoughts are in terms of what we can do about that.
Good question.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't fully know, but I mean, I think educational investments are the kind of things that will be hard to block. You know, the things that appear to adhere to have national security implications, telecoms companies, arms manufacturers, obviously that kind of stuff will be reviewed and is likely to be blocked on a fairly regular basis. But if you're going to try to make the argument to China, as Trump's going to do, that this economic relationship is unbalanced, Trump will be arguing for more market access for American companies, and it'll be a hard balance to strike with being more closing down Chinese investment. Indeed, I think one of the things that the Chinese will probably offer to Trump to try to assuage to him is the prospect of much more Chinese investment in America. What that then does to incentives is, and how that relationship, it sort of goes to the heart of the question is this a relationship defined by confrontation or is it a cooperative relationship? And the odd thing about the US-Chinese relationship is it's both. And the question is, how do you strike that balance between economic cooperation, which is, as the Chinese like to say, win-win, and the sense that actually these two countries are increasingly rivals? And there is no straightforward answer to it.
Yeah, Jim, again in the middle, and Jim Man. One more. Keep going. Yeah, thanks.
Sure. Hi, I'm Jim Mann, also from Johns Hopkins SAIS. I wanted to ask you about what you think there is left of the Chinese sense of Westernization. Someone mentioned education. I was going to ask you about that. Obviously, more than 25 years ago, people in China feel like they need to and want to send many of their kids to Western schools. Now, my own particular perspective is unusual because I lived in China in the 1980s when Westernization was the rage. The statue of Lin Zexu, who fought the Opium War, was taken from the center of Guangzhou and thrown on the outside like a picture of Stalin outside Budapest or something. Everybody wanted to be Western, and this phrase about the century of humiliation disappeared. I mean, I like to think of it as the Chinese sense of a century of humiliation with a few brief intervals that when it wasn't. And I can't tell, obviously, to what extent that remains, but there is a piece of me that wonders whether the nationalism is a reflection of the relationship between the party and ordinary people and whether it will endure.
Yeah, well, thanks. And it's nice to have a question from you. I really enjoyed the book you wrote a few years ago. I think you're one of the first people to say that the American assumption that China would just liberalize and become a democracy was not working out. And that's been amply borne out. So, yeah, how is this nationalism just sort of skin deep, or I mean, I think I'll make 2 points in response to what you had to say. First of all, I think one of the worrying things, and it relates to the previous question about the current generation of Chinese, is that they've been brought up on what they call this wolf's milk of nationalism, which was introduced into the curriculum post-Tiananmen, I'm told. And so there is a generation coming into power and into maturity that has been brought up on a highly nationalist narrative. And I know from my own country, the history that people learn at school really affects their view of what the country is and what its choices are, and how the outside world relates to them. And I think that is quite dangerous. That said, I mean, I think that, to slightly argue against the thesis of the book, although it's actually in the book, there is a big sense of vulnerability in the Chinese elite about Westernization. They don't think it's all going their way, so that post Ukraine and post particularly the Hong Kong uprising is the wrong word, but the demonstrations, umbrella movement, all of that. I was in Beijing at that time, and the official narrative was deeply paranoid. It was very similar to the Russian view that the West was trying to sponsor color revolutions in Ukraine and in the former Soviet space. The Chinese, I think, genuinely believed at some level that the Hong Kong thing was all whipped up by the CIA. They were thundering in the paper saying, let's get all this Western influence out of education. Let's have more Communist Party, Marxist-Leninist thought, inculcated in the university students. And that didn't strike me as the reaction of a society that was totally, leadership that was completely confident that it had things under control. On the contrary, they feel that we're out to get them and that we're sort of working at it and so on. So it's an odd mixture of pride, confidence, I think genuinely sense that things are moving their way, plus a suspicion of Western influence now, which is coming back. Maybe it's just a phase, but also maybe it's also a reflection of this growing sense of rivalry that they feel on their part, that actually the West has decided somehow to undermine them and to get rid of them, and doing it through cultural means. So it's a very mixed picture, but it's very weird being, as you know, if you go to Beijing, in some ways it feels just like there's Starbucks and everything, and people sitting there on their Apple Macs, cruising the internet, and yet you've got the Great Firewall, and which has been far more effective than people would have thought in walling China off. I
was in Beida a few weeks ago, Jim, meeting with a professor at a major university, talking about all these issues quite openly. And then the party discipline and inspection team came in, rifled through all his drawers. It's a very incongruous, strange time. Let me ask, we're gonna let you sign books. Let me ask you, finally, you're a keen observer of the US, of course, too, and the US may in some ways be the most important variable in this future. And your preface spends a lot of time about our new president. Can you give us a few minutes on how you see the trajectory of American internationalism based on your time in Washington?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny,
Does it make you feel better or worse being up close?
Well, I've only been here a few days now on this visit, but I mean,
that's enough for all of us. Yeah.
But it's funny, right? Trump is so volatile that the preface, which was meant to bring the book right up to date post-Trump, in funny ways, the most dated bit in the book, because Trump of January compared to Trump of April is like, so that when I was doing that, he just channeled challenged the one China policy. Tillerson had just made these statements about blocking China's access to the islands in the South China Sea. And yet, they then back off on that. Now the current scares are North Korea and trade, and if you were to write it now, it would look pretty alarming. Who knows what it's going to look like in 2 or 3 months' time?
Or 2 or 3 days.
Yeah, absolutely. But the question is Trump has a number of bees in his bonnet about China, and which one is he going to prioritize? Is a coherent policy going to emerge? Is it going to be a trade-centered policy? Is it going to be a North Korea-centered policy? Was the stuff about the South China Sea just Tillerson not knowing his brief and they really didn't mean anything? Or is there a thought behind it and actually you are going to see a confrontation there? I don't know. But I think one thing that actually is still up to date about that first attempt to grapple with what Trump might mean, at least in Asia, is that I think that there's this question about how he trades off strategic and economic issues, because I think previous presidents have said, okay, we've got an economic relationship with China, and that we want that to be good and prosperous and win-win, and then we have a set of strategic alliances, and those are not going to be contaminated by our commitment to Japan, South Korea. Those aren't going to be part of the economic relationship with China. That's a different issue. Trump at times has seemed to sort of imply that, well, if China gives me a good deal on trade, maybe we can talk about the other stuff. It's all part of a sort of continuum. And if I was an Asian power, I'd be a bit wary about that. How does he approach that? But then generally, the whole sort of where does liberal internationalism stand? Again, he goes backwards and forwards on this. So he trashes NATO, says it's obsolete. Then he says he's a huge supporter of it. Then, in fact, in the interview with us, he said not so keen on alliances, prefer partnerships. I don't think he's resolved these issues in his own mind. Maybe he never will. So it'll be a question of who has his ear. And I think that maybe we won't really get a full sense of it until the first really big crisis hits. Yeah. And then the question of what is his instinct? How does he respond in the crisis? And who actually says, Mr. President, this is the way to interpret this, and this is the way to go. That'll be the moment, I think.
We've had presidencies, including the Bush administration I worked for, certainly the Clinton administration, that came in with a lot of people who had theories about China. And then when the first problem hit, whether it was the EP3 or Taiwan Straits crisis for Clinton, and then the president, if they're serious about leading, figures out who actually knows their brief. Let's just hope that crisis isn't too big. Yeah. I see a stack of little red books out there.
Yes.
And I understand you're able to stay for a bit.
Yep.
And talk to folks. And why don't you do us a favor, let Gideon escape to his book signing station, and then feel free to come up and ask questions, say hello, buy books, and get them signed. Terrific effort, stimulating and thought-provoking, and really appreciate the chance to talk with you about the book today.
Well, as I said, I meant it. It is a privilege to talk about these issues here. So thank you.
Thank you. Great.